NC Pork, raising the bacon, raising the bar. Now, this game with Ole Miss was the 13th time, let me say that again, the 13th time this season that the Tar Heels had found themselves down by double digits in a game, including six games where Carolina was down by 20 or more points. 133 days ago, it was Carolina in the first of those six 20-point deficits against Kansas, and the Tar Heel season ends today with another in a game that David Glenn was the final one of the year for Hubert Davis's team. What are your impressions of the first round loss by the Tar Heels?
Well, there's a lot to unpack here, and let's start with this. Your reference to those 13 large early leads, you mentioned 13 of them. Remember, the Tar Heels lost 14 games, which means in all but one of their 14 losses, it fit the description that you just laid out, and which also fit the description of that 71-64 loss to Ole Miss. Keep in mind, the Rebels were only tied for sixth place in the 16-team Southeastern Conference. They are a very strong defensive team under Coach Chris Beard, but they've been more up and down offensively this year. And the Tar Heels simply didn't show up defensively out of the gate. It led to that large early lead, and as we've seen many times this year, the hole was just too big for even a valiant effort, even a furious comeback. If you play with fire enough times against quality opponents, of course, you're going to get burned, and the Tar Heels end up with this 14-loss season and an exit even prior to the round of 32. We'll get into a variety of things on this topic before we get to Duke and some new coaches that we have around the ACC. But let me start with the 60,000 feet view here. As we have said on our weekly Timeout College basketball show all season long, or for much of it, and as I've mentioned on the David Glenn show all season, Carolina's number one problem, before we get to these slow starts, before we get to second-guessing Hubert Davis, before we get to any player-related issues or dissections that occurred during the season, the number one problem was roster construction. Mm-hmm. We knew this last summer. We knew it in the preseason. We've talked about it all along. When you have a bunch of small guards in your rotation, Mike, you are asking for trouble defensively. When you lack a true rim protector style big man, as the Heels have had for most of my lifetime, if not longer, you are asking for trouble defensively. Sure enough, while UNC improved enough during the course of the regular season, offensively, they fought through those chemistry issues in the backcourt that we often discussed. They ended up in the top 20 in offensive efficiency. That's not bad. But that character or that roster construction issue, I think, prevented them from being a strong defensive team. They could have done a lot of things better. We'll get into those details. But the Heels ended up outside the top 50 in defensive efficiency. They couldn't slow down Kansas. They couldn't slow down Auburn. They couldn't slow down Alabama or Florida or Louisville or Clemson or a full-strength Duke team twice during the regular season in ACC competition. Every opponent that I just listed there put up 80-plus points on the Tar Heels in regulation. And I know it's a more offensive-minded game right now in college basketball, but that's a lot of points by Carolina's standards in particular. And if you keep giving up that many, even to those caliber of opponents, you're just going to lose more often than that program has been used to losing. But another quick reflection, given the end of the Tar Heels season. Beyond their personnel limitations, there were too many Tar Heels who did not improve enough during the course of this season. R.J. Davis actually did improve and play better down the stretch. Van Allen Lubin, the Vanderbilt transfer, did improve and embraced the system his first year in Hubert Davis's system. And he did get better month to month, no doubt about it. So let's give him credit in a different way than we give R.J. Davis credit. R.J., by the way, some of his rougher numbers against Duke at the ACC tournament, against Ole Miss in the round of 64, he was getting an extraordinary amount of defensive attention. And I would say that he played far more good than not over the last month and a half of that final year of his 5-year Carolina career. But elsewhere, as a sophomore point guard, Elliot Cadeau had many of the same turnover problems and many of the same three-point shooting problems he had as a freshman. There was some improvement with his three-point shot, but not nearly enough improvement with his decision-making, and that cost the Tar Heels again today against Ole Miss. Ian Jackson was a prep All-American, an NBA prospect, and even a player that Hubert Davis had praised earlier this season because of his passion for trying to get better in every way possible. Hubert even shared the Ian Jackson daily texts about, hey, coach, how can I get better today? Ian Jackson actually regressed during his freshman season in Chapel Hill. And there are a lot of fair questions about why. You want to sign prep All-Americans? Carolina hadn't been doing enough of that lately, even at the end of the Roy Williams era. Hubert Davis, to his credit, signed Drake Powell, prep All-American, signed Ian Jackson, prep All-American. Ian Jackson was a very poor defender for the entirety of the season, and he seemed to gradually lose confidence offensively too. Why? Carolina needs to reflect on that, because you can't have that happen often with your incoming prep All-Americans. In Ian Jackson's case, a guy who at some point, maybe even this year, is going to jump to the NBA. Seth Trimble was outstanding for the Tar Heels for most of the season as a defender and with his drives to the basket, but he completely lost confidence in his perimeter shot, and he just never got it back. How did that happen? Why did that happen? Cade Tyson, the Belmont transfer, started this season very slowly, never got better. Why did that happen? Jalen Withers improved in some areas, including his three-point shooting. He did become an asset in that category, but he showed up as a transfer from Louisville, making a lot of mental mistakes, a lot of defensive errors, and by the end of his 5th year of college, his 2nd year with the Tar Heels, those patterns continued. Why? Starting with Hubert Davis and his staff, his assistant coaches and beyond, Carolina needs to take an honest look at those issues and try to learn from what went wrong now that Hubert Davis obviously has that contract extension to 2030. Now that he has at least a couple of good years under his belt, trip to the national championship game, regular season ACC title, and a Sweet 16 just last year. But man, the roller coaster has been all over the place. And now that Carolina has built that infrastructure around Hubert Davis, Hubert and those closest to him have to ask themselves some of these hard questions and figure out the answers.
You know, one of the guys that was supposed to be on this year's Carolina team that would have helped in terms of rebounding, more of a stretch four, but a guy who had a pretty good defensive background, at least as a prep, was Zayden High, but he was dismissed from the team. He may or may not be back on the Carolina team a year from now. I talked to a member of the Carolina staff earlier today. I asked that question. They said that has yet to be determined. But it wasn't just that Carolina lacked their ability or their confidence to shoot when they did shoot. I mean, they were ugly shots today. You had shots that were just hitting the backboard. Earlier in the season, you had, especially from Cade Tyson, hitting the side of the backboard. Jackson, too. I mean, it really does make you wonder, and you're an experienced basketball mind, David. So tell everybody why, and because this is a widely held opinion, that Ian Jackson could go ahead and go to the NBA, maybe even Drake Powell go to the NBA. What does that say about the quality of who the NBA is looking for when you're taking kids out of college that are obviously not even good in college or consistent college? Maybe that's a better way to say it.
Well, as we know, the NBA is all about potential.
Yeah.
And if they foresee that you can become something relatively quickly, they might not pick you in the lottery if you're that kind of longer-term project, but they would spend a late first rounder or a second-round draft pick on you because of what they believe you can become. Drake Powell, for example, I thought was one of the more consistent Tar Heels in a positive way. He didn't shoot well down the stretch, but I thought he was one of their best defenders, even as a freshman. He has not only great athleticism and that long wingspan, but when Hubert Davis was getting into the Carolina huddle and saying, if y'all don't make your opponents uncomfortable offensively by getting in their grill and just disrupting them, your season's going to end. And that's exactly what ended up happening. Drake Powell and Seth Trimble are maybe the only two guys in the Carolina rotation that didn't often need reminders about the importance of getting in your opponent's grill. Now, one's a freshman, Drake Powell. Another is he has not always been comfortable being a really vocal guy. But one thing that I would underline, in addition to the earlier observations about the Tar Heels in general, is that Hubert Davis and his staff need to think more broadly. In other words, let me put it this way. Rather than the accumulation of talent, which every coach is interested in, I think the Heels have to do a better job of thinking about pieces that fit together. In other words, there's no problem signing a guy who's 5'11" if you think he's really, really good at certain skills that your system needs. Carolina has had plenty of smallish point guards where if they were just incredible ball handlers and you just couldn't take the ball away from them, and they pushed, what Roy Williams used to want to call the fastest fast break in America, and they made good decisions. You don't have to be a great three-point shooter and 6'5" and all the other things if you're really, really good at those other things. But you got to be careful about having too many small players. You have to be careful about getting stuck in a year where you don't have a single true big man shot blocker, rim protector, or somebody who can catch the ball in the low post consistently and score. Carolina has had that for every single year dating to the 1960s, and they didn't have it this year. And that's not just my opinion. Carolina has always had a double-digit scorer in the post, always, dating to the 1960s when Dean Smith took over. They didn't have that this year. Van Allen Lubin's a hard-working, undersized post player. Jalen Washington seems to be a great kid who's simply not yet talented enough to be a starting caliber player in the Atlantic Coast Conference. Doesn't mean they can't be on the UNC roster, but if you're counting on a lineup that's really small in the backcourt and fairly small in the post and you don't have a shot blocker, that gets back to no coach in America was going to make this Carolina team a great defensive squad. But when I say puzzle pieces fitting together, that can mean not just X's and O's, not just sizes. It can mean personalities. And I think one of the reasons that the Tar Heels started slowly so often is that they don't have either a Tyler Hansbrough, whose intensity is so off the charts, they called him Psycho T, or just somebody, even last year, Mike, you saw Harrison Ingram Stanford transfer and Cormac Ryan Notre Dame transfer. Those guys weren't afraid of any coach, any opponent, taller guy, shorter guy, muscular guy, road hostile environment. They weren't afraid of anybody or anything. Not only were they older players, and to varying degrees, they were talented players. I mean, Harrison Ingram was an all-ACC caliber talent, and you better sign talent, right? Mm-hmm. That's still important. But the puzzle pieces have to fit together beyond talent. You can't have too many ball-dominant guards, right? You can't have too many undersized post players. You can't have too many players who lose their man defensively the way Jalen Withers did repeatedly this season, and including on one of those early Ole Miss three-pointers. When you don't start the game well, and this is to your point earlier about the 13 large deficits that you circled in the Tar Heels' 14 defeats this season, what happens psychologically? Your opponent gains confidence. The way to play basketball is you have to be shot out of a cannon with intensity from the opening tip so that your opponent never gets comfortable, never gets in a rhythm, never starts to relax and feel good about how things are going. The same shooter that maybe you accidentally left open once or twice and hit his first two, that guy becomes a better shooter for the rest of the game. If you're in his grill and he misses his first and maybe his second because you're playing better defense and you're switching the way you're supposed to and you're not losing your man, that same guy might not have a good shooting night at all because he started slowly and the mental impact, the mental aspect of the game comes much more into play. The year that the Heels had Cormac Ryan and Harrison Ingram, it was okay that RJ Davis was not a vocal leader. It was okay that Armando Bacot had his own style of personality with all of his quirks and some swagger in his own way, but not really, a cheerleading type leader. It's okay. But if you don't have any of those guys, it doesn't work. Again, you can have the one small guy because you're just not getting pounded repeatedly where the Heels have 2 or 3 small perimeter players that are posted up by Ole Miss down low. I mean, your size is just working against you over and over and over defensively, and it even impacts you offensively, right? Because those little guys going into the lane, as tough as Seth Trimble is and RJ Davis is, of course you're going to get your shot blocked more often than if you're just one of these longer leapers and more athletic guys who are gliding into the lane for those same kinds of attacks on the rim. It's all about puzzle pieces fitting together. The Heels didn't have that on-court leadership, not in the form of a Hansbrough or in the form of a Cormac Ryan or in the form of a Harrison Ingram, who did it 3 different ways. And they also had just a very odd chemistry where, Elliot Cadeau was a great passer, but also led the ACC in turnovers. Early this season, RJ Davis went from being last year's first-team All-American to something much, much less than that, and a guy who only made second-team All-Conference after being a first-team All-American. That's because the puzzle pieces weren't fitting together very well. And it's okay if one guy is more of a driver than a shooter, but you better not have too many guys who are more driver than shooter. It's about balance. And this Carolina team lacked balance between offense and defense. It lacked balance between shooting and driving. It lacked balance in terms of its height distribution. It just was not a well-constructed roster, and that fact came back to haunt the Tar Heels time after time after time, and it's one of the biggest reasons that their season has come to an end.
And maybe it's a benefit to everybody involved that the Carolina season is over and they can start to focus on evaluating their own roster, deciding who they want to have back, the players themselves deciding, as you alluded to earlier, if they want to come back and accept whatever role is going to be shared with them from the coaching staff. But remember, there's a new general manager and executive director in his official title, Jim Tanner, with the Tar Heel program. He's a former agent, not a personnel guy. So this guy isn't going to come in and make personnel decisions. That is certainly going to be part of a new staff. But those relationships, though they've been somewhat talked about in the public eye, have yet to be fully consummated. So hopefully that will be done sooner than later now. And I think you'll see some of those move into high gear now administratively with Bubba Cunningham and his underlings working along with Hubert Davis and Jim Tanner. But they have to make changes for this program to keep up because the ACC, brother, is getting tougher. And we're going to talk about some of those new coaching hires, Ryan Odom at Virginia, Will Wade at North Carolina State to go along with Andy Enfield at SMU and Pat Kelsey at Louisville. And, of course, John Shire is right over there. Then you have Brad Brownell, who's a pretty good coach, and Steve Forbes, who has some experience. There's some experienced coaches among those that I just mentioned, and only Shire has not been a multi-stop head coach. So it really comes back to, on the Carolina sideline, we talked about it. This roster was not put together by anybody that had any vision, or maybe they were doing it with more hope than reality in their brain. Do you foresee any scenario to where the most loyal Tar Heel, perhaps on record, Hubert Ira Davis, makes changes to his assistant coaching staff of Jeff Lebo, Dean Smith player from the 80s, or Brad Frederick, who is a Roy Williams player, or Sean May, who is a most outstanding player in the Final Four, or even Marcus Page? All the three in the last that I mentioned are all Roy Williams players. Will Hubert Davis tinker with that and try to freshen things up and get a new voice along with his own in the daily practice sessions and the personnel matters along with this team?
My guess, Mike, is no. Hubert is a little slow to change, Remember, it wasn't Bubba Cunningham, UNC's athletic director, who didn't want a general manager for men's basketball. Bubba's stance was, I listened to my coaches. And when his women's basketball coach wanted a general manager, she got one. And when Bill Belichick, football coach, wanted a general manager, he got one. And gradually, a somewhat slow to change Hubert Davis decided he wanted one too. And now, of course, he has one. I think Hubert's mindset is going to be more, now that they have a general manager, now that they're flushing out the staff with more analytics support and player branding support, and a lot of the things that, for example, Duke has had for 3 years running, I think he believes that that's the change that was needed. And now it's being honest about this roster where, Mike, obviously R.J. Davis has exhausted his eligibility. So has Jalen Withers. So has the backup big man, Ty Claude. But that means there's, I believe it's 9 Carolina players who are eligible to return. Now, maybe Ian Jackson turns pro. Maybe Drake Powell turns pro. Inevitably, somebody is likely to want to transfer out. But there's 9 eligible to return. There's, of course, the 3 high school players, Isaiah Dennis and Derek Dixon, are backcourt guards, kind of combo guards in both cases, top 50 players in the high school senior class, but not necessarily, McDonald's All-American caliber guys. And Caleb Wilson, who is that caliber of a guy, is a power forward from Atlanta. So the bottom line is, whether it's 8 or 9 guys are eligible to return and 3 are signed or committed for the inbound, you're getting closer to, under a new system, what would be a 15 scholarship roster limit, where not all coaches are necessarily going to use all 15 scholarships because that can create chemistry issues. But let's assume a few transfer out. Let me bottom line it this way. Hubert Davis, among the ideas he needs to get used to in terms of just the changing ways of way Carolina basketball has done things for a long time, unless you recruit high school prospects, plural, at the very highest level, the way John Shire at Duke did this past year with Cooper Flagg and Con Knipple and Kaman Malawach and others, all in that number 1 ranked high school incoming class. You will not be a top 25 team in America or even an ACC contender if you have only a single high-impact transfer. That's the new world that we're living in. Louisville had a bunch of them this year and finished as the number 2 seed. 2 of Clemson's 4 best players were high-impact major college transfers. They were the 3 seed in this league. Duke could afford to seek out role players from the transfer portal because they knew it. They already had their superstars in the form of those special freshmen. They certainly got what they needed at Duke in the form of those role players, but most programs are not like that. They're not signing enough of those immediate impact freshmen. So Hubert Davis has to get back to where, he found Harrison Ingram and Cormac Ryan in the same transfer class. It was okay that Jalen Withers wasn't quite as good in that same transfer class. It was okay that Paxson Wojcik, who actually began that year as a starter for the Tar Heels, didn't turn out to be a starting caliber player in the Atlantic Coast Conference. It was okay that 2 of the 4 weren't all that great because he found 2 of his better players in Harrison Ingram and Cormac Ryan. What happened this year? Van Allen Lubin of Vanderbilt turned out better than expected and was plenty helpful. But Ty Claude of Georgia Tech was never expected to be more than a deep bench guy. And Cade Tyson of Belmont just never clicked with the system and was not much help at all by the end of the season. So you better sign at least 1 potential All-ACC player, at least 1 in the transfer portal every year, and 1 potential All-ACC player out of the high school ranks every year. If you're not doing both of those things, and I say at least 1, obviously you'd love more. Caleb Wilson fits that description for the Heels this year in the high school ranks. Maybe those other guys will turn out great as well. We'll see. But you need that. You're falling way short of the way Carolina has done things for a half century if you're not now doing both of those things from the high school recruiting ranks. But also the transfer portal is it's producing half of the best players in this league. And you can't have just Van Allen Lubin in a given year and very little else and expect not to fall back into the middle of the ACC pack, which is exactly what happened to the Tar Heels this year.
You know, it was something we talked about on Timeout, the Tobacco Road basketball show that we have every week here on the North Carolina Sports Network. A few weeks back, we actually played the clip from Rick Pitino where he said he wasn't even going to recruit high school players anymore because he can't replace experienced men with boys. And when you look at the North Carolina roster and everything that you just mentioned, there's only one point guard on that roster coming back because Caleb Wilson is a power forward who's a stretch and likes to get out and run and shoot and do everything. Isaiah Dennis from Davidson Day in Charlotte is a combo guard. He's not a point guard. Derek Dixon is a combo guard. He's not a true point guard, more like Seth Trimble. So only Elliot Cadeau, who, as you said, is a pretty good passer, but still led the ACC in turnovers, is the only point guard on the roster. And there's still not anybody on the roster who is a dead-eye three-point shooter. Everybody just left the building who was doing that, and that was Withers and R.J. Davis. And there's also not anybody that can get rebounds. And so you got to figure that everybody that we've talked about might not be coming back. And that goes for the kind of tradition that we've had time immemorial with North Carolina basketball, to where they bring people up from the JV or have walk-ons, or the people that, you know, they put in at the end of the game when they're getting ready to give out Bojangles biscuits for getting to 100 points. I mean, there is a lot of pressure this year on North Carolina, and maybe you're not going to find those guys domestically. Maybe Jim Tanner is going to use some of those international contacts, and you're going to see some international flavor come to the roster. And that hasn't been very often that North Carolina has had international players, truly international players. You've had guys who were exchange students like Henrik Rodel on the 93 team that was a proven international player and brought that kind of edge to the game. Ademola Okalaja, may he rest in peace, was also that kind of guy coming out of Germany. But Carolina is really at a crossroads because, you know, Ryan Odom at Virginia, and we're going to talk about him again a little bit later, he's going to be a pretty good recruiter, maybe bringing some of his guys from VCU to Charlottesville, making that hour-and-a-half drive from the capital city, the Commonwealth, in Richmond. And Will Wade's going to bring some guys from McNeese, and he's going to be all over the portal. He's going to be slinging money left and right. So this is a very important 60-day, 90-day period for North Carolina basketball, and something that I know we'll be looking forward to covering right here on the North Carolina Sports Network. NC Pork, good for the plate, great for the state.